Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into Eastory's Western Front 1944-45 Part 2. After this series ends, I'm going to leave it to y'all on what to start next. So I have the Caesar series going. The Hannibal series is done. It's edited. I'm going to, in two-part increments, just drop it over the weekend. So it'll be a total Hannibal content load over the weekend. But for the next series to start, I'm looking at extra credits Genghis Khan series and extra credits Bismarck series. So Otto von Bismarck, Genghis Khan, one of those is going to be next. When I get to the subscriber amount that YouTube wants for me to be able to do polls, then I'll do this all through polls. But since my hands are kind of tied right now, just comment below what direction you want me to go in next, which series you want me to go, and I'll look at them and figure it out, and we'll start with that series next. With all that being said, let's get into the Eastory video.
In the second part of 1944, Germany had suffered its worst defeat yet. The Soviet forces had advanced up to the German border. In the west, the Allies had landed in France and moved up to the German frontiers. The Red Army and the Allies were preparing to launch a final offensive into Germany in early 1945. The Western Allies planned to carry out smaller attacks before the offensive. Their goal was to break through the German defenses of the Siegfried Line and the Rhine River. They planned to do that with attacks in the north and south. In the south, the German position was weak. The Allies first encircled Metz, and after that they broke through the German lines and reached the Rhine. The Germans had to retreat. In the north, they pulled back to the Siegfried Line, where they stopped the Allies. In the south, they consolidated their forces in a smaller area to tie up more of the Allied forces. At the same time, they had also launched their attack in the north. They had already broken through the Siegfried Line and planned to cover the remaining land to the Rhine. The Germans were better prepared to defend against the northern attack. The Allies launched the attack in mid-November, but the progress was slow. The Germans sent reinforcements to the sector and denied any opportunity to make a breakthrough. By mid-December,
so the Germans obviously don't have the manpower. They don't have the strength to hold off the two fronts altogether, right? They're constantly getting pushed back and pushed back. But essentially what they do is start picking and choosing very strategic places to make a stand, right? So they decide they're going to make a stand somewhere. They get as many troops as they can spare and centralize them in an area, and then try to hold back a major advance on the east and western fronts.
the Allies had achieved only limited gains. The Germans knew that in order to avoid defeat, they needed to go on an offensive. Therefore, they decided to use their last limited forces to launch an attack on the Western Front. They were...
Okay, so I totally disagree with that. The idea that the only way they could win is to lose is not what I would say is a great grand strategy. They did not have the resources or manpower to have an offensive that was going to do anything drastic in either direction, east or west. And so, obviously, that's a futile attempt to cause a breakout or anything like that. It doesn't matter. There are no strategic goals within reach that could drastically change the direction of this war that Germany has the strength to achieve. So I feel like the idea of going on the offensive was just a brutally bad calculation in a string of bad calculations that the Germans made once they started getting pushed back. I feel like basically it just, the whole name of the game here is prolong, right? As hold out for as long as you can, make it as costly for the Eastern and Western Front allies to advance. You're giving up land for lives and time. And that is basically the name of the game here for Germany. You throw that out the window and basically go on an all or nothing run that is almost all nothing in going on an offensive. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Unable to gather an overwhelming force and instead hoped to catch the Allies off guard. The Allies were attacking in the north and the south. Between them was an area which was known as the Ardennes, which was held weakly by the Allies. The Germans planned to pass through the Ardennes before the Allies could bring up reinforcements and then move to the sea and cut off a large part of Allied troops. The German attack was divided.
If this sounds familiar to you, it is because we literally just watched this in the 1940 video of the invasion of France. It is not the exact same plan strategically, but it is almost exactly the same plan strategically. They are going to bust through the Ardennes. They are going to essentially try to do the exact same thing that they did in 1940, but they're going to do it when they have a ton of men on the Eastern Front, a ton of men who have died, no oil, no manpower, and this whole operation is going to be run on essentially hopes and dreams.
Into the supporting offensive in the south and the main offensive in the north. In the main sector, only the southernmost attack could break through. The Allies then brought up their first reinforcements and halted the German breakthrough. The German northern attack had failed. In the south, the Germans broke through the Allied lines on a wide front. The Allies rushed in an airborne division to hold the important road junction of Bastogne. The Germans bypassed it and continued.
The 101st Airborne, they are an extremely famous division. If you've never heard the story about the surrender and the nuts response that they give and all that, it's a pretty good one. 101st Airborne is an extremely famous division, at least in the U.S. It's an extremely famous division for people that, study military history.
Continued their advance. However, their advance had been too slow and the Allies began to arrive in force to the sector. The Germans consolidated their forces in the northern direction to continue the advance, but by that time the Allies launched an attack from the south and re-established connection with Bastogne. In order to divert the Allies away from the Ardennes, the Germans launched an attack in the south. The Allies were now faced with the dangers of the Germans resuming the Ardennes offensive and with their southern attack. The offensive in the Ardennes was more dangerous for the Allies and they concentrated their efforts there. They launched a two-pronged attack against the German salient. The German units were threatened with encirclement and were forced to pull their forces back to a more secure location. With the Allied position in the Ardennes more secure, they could now send troops against the southern attack. At the same time, the Allies had been giving ground to the Germans, but the arrival of Allied reinforcements from the Ardennes helped to halt their advance. With the immediate danger taken care of, the Allies decided to secure their position in this sector by destroying the German pocket around Colmar so that the Germans could not use it for launching future attacks. The Germans did not have the strength to hold the pocket and they were pushed over the Rhine. By that time, the Red Army had finished preparations and launched its main offensive in the east. The Red Army quickly advanced, encountering limited resistance. Soon their forces were coming near Berlin. With this new danger, the Eastern Front became the main priority for the Germans, and they moved away some of their troops from the Western Front.
And not only did it become a major priority for the Germans, it became a major priority for the rest of the Allies that are over there on the Western Front. This becomes essentially a race, right? The Allies are worried that the Soviet Union is not, that every foot that they take, that they quote unquote liberate from the Germans, that every foot of it will be essentially brought under the fold of the Soviet Union once the war ends. And so the Western Front doesn't like that. There is political and military leaders in all of the countries that are participating on the Western Front that are discussing the best way to go about this. I said in another video that there are people in the military hierarchy that think that the Western Front should push to Berlin, which collapses Germany, and then continue until they take the spot of the German army against the Eastern Front. and then they basically just have a non-stop conflict that was against Germany and then immediately after that against the Soviet Union. That is a real idea in the heads of people in power in the militaries of these Western Allied countries.
The Germans now switched to full-on defensive in the west, and their forces retreated to the Siegfried Line. By that time, the Allies had built up their supplies and forces to launch a massive attack on the Western Front. They would capture the western bank of the Rhine first from the north, and then from the south. After that, they would cross the Rhine in 2 locations and then capture the Ruhr, which housed large parts of German war industry. The Germans were strongly outnumbered, but they were ordered to avoid retreat and hold their positions. The Allies started their northern attack in early February. In the south, the Germans made use of rough terrain and were able to contain the Allied advance. In the center, the Germans had opened the dams on the Loire River, creating a temporary flood which prevented the Allies from crossing it. With the central part of the front quiet, they were able to gather enough forces to contain the Allied advance in the north. But then the water levels in the Loire dropped and the Allies crossed the river. The Germans were unable to hold them off and were pushed back, suffering large casualties. They retreated over the Rhine, destroying the bridges behind them. The Allies then turned south. The German lines collapsed and they lost half of their strength as prisoners. In the chaos, the Allies were able to capture an intact bridge over the Rhine at Remagen. They established a bridgehead over the river. The Allies moved in to capture the last German-controlled area west of Rhine. The Germans were somewhat able to contain the Allied attack from the south, but in the north, the Allies advanced through the German lines with little opposition. The Germans began a belated retreat, but a lot of their soldiers were taken prisoner. In the confusion, the Allies were able to cross the Rhine in several places. By that time, the Allies had finished their preparations for the northern Rhine crossing. The Germans were unable to resist it, and the Allies established themselves on the east shore. The German decision not to allow retreat over the Rhine had proven to be disastrous. They had lost 300,000 men as prisoners alone and were now unable to defend the Rhine River defenses. The Allies now set out to neutralize the German war industry in the Ruhr. The Allies moved east, which made the Germans overextend their defenses. The Allies then turned north and outflanked them. At the same time, they broke out of the northern bridgehead, and soon both of the Allied forces linked up and encircled the Germans in the Ruhr. Most of the German forces in the area had been caught in the pocket, and the way into Germany was open. The Allies advanced east. Large areas of Germany fell to the Allies with little opposition. The Germans still had significant forces around Berlin. Part of them were sent to block the Allied advance, but they were too few and were encircled and destroyed. The Allies established a defensive line along the Elbe River. Then the Germans had to concentrate on repelling the Raid Army's attack on Berlin. By that time, the German resistance on the Western Front was collapsing, but they still had strong forces on other fronts, and there was the danger that the Germans could pull their forces into the Alps and make a final stand. The Allies turned south in order to reach the Alps before the Germans could.
So this was a decision that the Western Allies had to make, right? Like I said, there's a thought process that the Soviets are on your team, but they're not really on your team, right? So what do you do here? Do you do the thing that is quickest and will save the most lives in ending the war against Germany? Or do you do the thing that will set you up better going forward against the Soviet Union? The Western Allies decide they are going to defeat Germany first. They're not going to run to Berlin before they go south and completely demolish Germany's ability to mount a major defensive.
Set up strong defensive positions there. However, in reality, the Germans had no intentions in making a final stand in the mountains, and after the fall of Berlin had removed Hitler from power, their new government surrendered unconditionally in early May. Now, with the war over, I would like to mention the officers and enlisted men of the E Company for staying with me through the campaign all the way from landing beaches of Normandy to the foothills of the Alps.
Okay, so that was Eastory's World War II Western Front 1944-45. Like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over there. Comment below which series you want me to start next. And I'll see you guys next time.